The alarms on the Vantor had been screaming for 6 minutes straight, and I still had not found the will to silence them. My name is Zarek Voss, and I was the last chronicler of the HFY people. On that day I stood on the bridge of our final arc ship, watching a wall of enemy vessels grow larger on the view screen, and I understood, with a calm that frightened me, that I might be about to record the final entry of our entire history. 312 of us remained. 312, spread across a ship built to carry 10,000. The empty corridors of the Vantor had become tombs long before any weapon touched them, hollowed out by disease, by starvation, by the slow grinding despair of a people nobody wanted alive. "Marshal Vok is hailing us again," said Erin, my old friend and the ship's last surviving pilot. Her voice did not shake. She had stopped being afraid a long time ago. Fear takes energy, and we had none left to spare. "Put him through," I said. The face that appeared on the screen belonged to a tall, pale being with silver eyes and no patience left for us. Marshal Idrene Vok commanded the enforcement fleet of the Concord, the alliance of civilizations that ruled most of known space. He had been sent to finish something that should have ended, in his opinion, 100 years earlier. "This is your final notice," Vok said. "The Concord Tribunal has revoked all remaining protections for HFY vessels. Your species was found guilty of war crimes during the Second Expansion conflict. That judgment stands. You have 20 minutes to evacuate escape pods, though I remind you that no world in Concord space will accept your landing." I had heard variations of this speech before. Every few years, some new commander arrived to remind us of a war fought by our great-grandparents. A war we had not chosen, a war whose debts had somehow become ours to pay forever. "Marshal," I said, stepping toward the camera, "there are children on this ship. There are elders who cannot leave a medical bed without dying within the hour. 20 minutes changes nothing for them." "That is not my concern," Vok said. "It was not your ancestors' concern either, when they burned 3 Concord colonies to ash. I did not write these laws, chronicler. I only enforce them." The channel closed. I want to explain, before I go further, what it means to be forgotten. It does not happen all at once. It happens slowly, the way frost creeps across a window. First the trade routes close to us, then the medical exchanges. Then the embassies, one by one, stopped answering our messages. Species who had once called us allies began to speak of us only in the past tense, as though we had already died and they were simply waiting for the paperwork to catch up with reality. We were guilty, they said, of a war none of us alive had fought. Guilty by blood, guilty by name. And so, for 4 generations, the HFY had drifted from system to system, chased out of orbit after orbit, buying fuel from smugglers at prices meant to bleed us dry, until there was nothing left to bleed. Now here we were, one ship, 312 souls, 20 minutes. "Zarek," Erin said quietly, "the reactor can give us maybe 2 hours of full power before it fails completely. After that, we have no shields, no engines, nothing. Even if the Marshal grants an extension, we are already dying. We have been dying for a long time." I looked at the golden light of our home star reflected faintly on the hull sensors, a star we had not touched soil under in 3 generations, and I felt something old and tired settle into my chest. Not fear, something heavier than fear. Acceptance. "Record this," I told the ship's archive system, my voice steady only because I refused to let it break. "Let it be known that the HFY people faced their end with dignity, and that we forgave no one, because there was no one left who deserved our forgiveness." The archive light blinked, accepting my words into a memory that might never be read by anyone again. That was when the second signal appeared. It came from nowhere on our charts, a small, unarmored vessel dropping out of faster-than-light travel less than 2,000 kilometers from the Concord battle line. Erin's hands flew across her console, and I watched her expression shift from confusion to something close to disbelief. "That is not a Concord ship," she said. "That is not any registry I recognize." "Identify it," I said. I am trying. The transponder code it is answering an old distress protocol. Zarek, that protocol has not been active in decades. Nobody monitors it anymore. Nobody has for years. On the screen, the newcomer looked almost fragile compared to the gray war vessels of the Concorde fleet. It was smaller, its hull marked with scrapes and old repairs, clearly a working ship rather than a warship, the kind used for hauling cargo or answering emergency calls in the outer systems. A single word was painted along its side, in a script I did not recognize at the time but would come to know very well. Halcyon. They are hailing the Concorde fleet, Iran said. Not us. Them. I leaned closer to the console, my heart's pounding in that old rhythm my species uses when something impossible is happening in front of us. A voice came through, translated automatically by our systems into words I could understand, a voice belonging to a species I had only read about in old, dusty trade records. Humans, a species so new to the wider galaxy that most civilizations barely acknowledged their existence, let alone respected their opinions. This is Captain Owen Hale, of the independent relief vessel Halcyon, the voice said. We picked up an old format distress beacon 11 hours ago and altered course to respond. I count several hundred life signs aboard that ARC ship and what looks like a fleet preparing to end them. Somebody want to explain what I'm looking at? Marshal Voch's voice cut in immediately, sharp with irritation. This is a Concorde Tribunal enforcement action. You are ordered to withdraw immediately or be considered in violation of Concorde space law. There was a pause, a long one, long enough that I found myself holding my breath, though I could not have told you why. Perhaps some instinct in me already understood that something rare was about to happen, something that would matter far beyond that single moment. With respect, Marshal, Hale said, and I could hear something in his tone that I did not yet have a word for, something between confusion and quiet, immovable stubbornness. I don't answer to Concorde law. I answer to the beacon, and the beacon says people are dying over there. That vessel belongs to a species under active judgment for war crimes, Voch said. I would advise you to review their history before offering sympathy. I don't need their history, Hale replied. I need to know if there are children on that ship who didn't ask to be born into somebody else's war. Do you have an answer for that, Marshal, or just paperwork? The bridge of the Vantor had gone completely silent. Every crew member who could still stand had gathered near the view screen, staring at the small human ship as though it were something out of a story told to frighten children to give them hope in the dark. I had lived my entire life learning that no one in this galaxy offered anything without demanding a price first. Alliances came with tribute. Aid came with obligation. Every hand extended toward the Asherel in the past century had closed into a fist the moment we could not pay what was asked. And yet here was a single, unarmed vessel, crewed by a species barely a footnote in galactic records, standing directly between us and an entire enforcement fleet, for no reason I could understand. You have no authority here, Voch said, his voice rising now, the calm control slipping from it. One relief ship cannot stop a tribunal action. Maybe not, Hale said, but I can make sure the entire settled galaxy knows exactly what happened here today, Marshal, because I am broadcasting this conversation on every open channel my ship can reach. You want to fire on defenseless civilians, you go right ahead. Just know there will be a record of it, a permanent one. I do not know, even now, whether it was the threat of exposure or something else entirely that made Marshal Voch hesitate. Perhaps he had simply never expected resistance from a species with so little military strength to back its words. Whatever the reason, the great gray ships of the Concorde fleet did not fire. Not that day. This is not finished, Voch said finally, his voice cold. You have bought them time, human. Nothing more. The Concorde fleet began to withdraw, forming a loose blockade at the edge of the system rather than retreating entirely, clearly unwilling to leave without some kind of victory, even a small one. But the immediate threat had passed, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the Vantor's alarms fell silent because there was, for the moment, nothing left to warn us about. I turned to Iron, who was staring at the small human vessel on our screen, with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Something close to wonder. "Hail them," I said. Properly this time. When Captain Hale's face finally appeared on our screen, I found myself struggling to speak, my mind still catching up with the sudden, dizzying shift from certain ending to uncertain continuation. "Chronicler Zarek Voss," I managed at last. "On behalf of what remains of the Asherel people, I offer you our gratitude, though I confess I do not understand it. Why would your species risk conflict with the Concord for people you have never met?" Hale was quiet for a moment, and when he answered, his voice carried none of the sharpness he had used against Marshal Vach. It was simply tired and honest, in a way that struck me more deeply than any diplomatic speech I had ever received. "Where I come from," he said, "we used to leave people behind too. Cost us more than I can explain to you in one conversation. We decided a while back that we weren't going to be that kind of people anymore. Doesn't matter who's asking or who's judging. If somebody's drowning, you don't check their paperwork before you throw the rope." I did not know it then, but that single sentence would become the first line of a story that would be told across 100 worlds within a decade, the story of a forgotten species and the strangers who refused to let them stay forgotten. But in that moment, I only knew one thing for certain. For the first time in 4 generations, someone had looked at the Asherel and not seen a debt to be collected. They had simply seen people worth saving. The Concord fleet remained at the edge of our system through the night, and I did not sleep, though not from fear this time. I stayed on the bridge, watching the small human ship hold its position between us and the darkness, and I began, for the first time in my long, weary life, to let myself imagine a future. It was a dangerous thing to imagine. Hope always is, for people who have been disappointed as many times as we had. But as I watched Captain Hale's ship refuse to move, refused to abandon its position no matter how the Concord fleet postured and threatened through the long hours of that night, I found I could not stop myself. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I allowed myself to hope that the story of my people might not end here after all. The morning brought a message I did not expect, not from the Concord, but from Captain Hale himself, requesting permission to come aboard the Vantor in person. I granted it before Iron had even finished translating the request, eager, perhaps too eager, to look this stranger in the eyes and understand what kind of being would risk everything for people he had never met. He arrived with only one companion, a young woman named Ellen Marsh, who served as his pilot, and, as I would soon learn, his oldest friend from a small coastal town on a world called Earth. They wore simple gray uniforms without the elaborate rank markings I had seen on Concord officers, and they walked through our dim, half-powered corridors with an expression I had not expected. Not pity, something closer to quiet anger, the kind that comes from seeing a wrong that should never have been allowed to happen. "How long has it been like this?" Hale asked, looking at the flickering lights above us, at the sealed doors leading to decks we no longer had the power to maintain. "4 generations," I said. "My grandmother remembered when this ship carried 10,000 of us, when we still had a homeworld to return to between voyages. I have only ever known the drifting." Hale stopped walking. He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw something shift behind his eyes, a decision being made. "Nobody's homeworld anymore?" he asked. "The Concord took it?" "They did not take it," I said. "They simply made it impossible for us to return. Trade embargoes, travel restrictions. No world would resupply our fuel if we set course for our own system, for fear of Concord punishment. Eventually, a blockade you cannot cross becomes the same as a wall." Ellen Marsh made a small sound beside me, something between disbelief and disgust, quickly suppressed. "That's not law," she said. "That's just cruelty wearing a uniform." I did not know how to respond to that, because in all my years chronicling the slow decline of my people, no one from any species had ever named it so plainly or seemed so troubled by it. We spoke for hours that day, in the dim light of our failing ship, and I told Hale everything. I told him of the second expansion conflict, the war that had ended before either of us was born, fought between an alliance of expanding colonies and a coalition that included the HFY among many others. I told him how, when the war ended, most of that coalition negotiated peace and returned to their lives, but the HFY had been singled out, blamed disproportionately for atrocities that historians still argued had been committed by several species acting together. "Why your people specifically?" Hale asked. "Because we were small," I admitted, the truth tasting bitter even after all these years. "Because punishing us cost the Concord nothing, and made an example that kept larger, more useful species in line. It is easier to sacrifice the weak than to hold the powerful accountable." Hale was quiet for a long moment after that. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady in a way that told me he meant every word. "That's not going to keep happening," he said. "Not while I'm breathing, anyway." I wanted to believe him. I wanted it so badly that I forced myself to be cautious, because hope, in my experience, was simply grief that had not yet arrived. "Captain," I said carefully, "I do not doubt your intentions. But you are one ship. The Concord commands thousands. Whatever debt you believe you owe us, you do not owe it enough to lose your life, or the lives of your crew, over strangers from a species most of the galaxy has already decided to forget." Hale smiled then, the first real smile I had seen from him, though there was something tired behind it, something that spoke of battles fought long before he ever answered our beacon. "Chronicler," he said, "let me tell you something about my species. We're new to all this. Barely 100 years since we figured out faster-than-light travel. We don't have some grand empire. We don't have some ancient council of elders deciding who lives and who gets left to die in the dark. What we do have is a habit of remembering our own worst mistakes and trying not to repeat them. We left people behind before, whole groups of them, back on our own world, because helping them was inconvenient, or expensive, or politically messy. We are not doing that again. Not to you, not to anyone, if we can help it." That evening, after Hale and Marsh returned to the Halcyon, I sat alone in the ship's archive chamber and recorded what I had learned, my hands trembling slightly as I spoke into the recorder. "The humans," I said, "are unlike any species I have encountered in my long life. They do not calculate the cost of kindness before offering it. Whether this makes them wise or simply young, I cannot yet say, but I begin to believe that the galaxy has not seen a species like them before, and I do not think it is prepared for what that means." 3 days later, the true test of Hale's promise arrived. A convoy of small transport vessels dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of our system, flying under a flag I did not recognize, a simple blue and white banner belonging to something called the United Earth Coalition, the young, still-forming government of humanity's core worlds. Erin hailed them immediately, her voice tight with a mixture of hope and suspicion that I understood completely. "This is Admiral Daniel Cole, of the supply convoy Meridian Run," came the response, a voice older and more measured than Hale's, carrying the weight of someone who had made difficult decisions before and understood their cost. "We are responding to a formal request for humanitarian relief filed by Captain Hale of the Halcyon. We are carrying medical supplies, food stores, and technical personnel authorized to assist with repairs to your vessel." I stood on the bridge, watching 6 transport ships align themselves in orbit near our failing arc, and I felt something in my chest that I had not allowed myself to feel in longer than I could measure. Not simply hope this time, but something sturdier. Something like trust. "Admiral," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "the Concord has declared this system under active blockade. Your convoy risks direct conflict by delivering aid here." "We're aware," Cole said simply. "Our government reviewed the situation and determined that humanitarian relief does not constitute a violation of any treaty we have signed with the Concord, since we never signed the treaty that condemned your people in the first place. We intend to test that position today. If the Concord wishes to fire on unarmed relief vessels delivering food and medicine to starving civilians, they are welcome to explain that decision to every media outlet in known space." It was, I would later learn, a carefully constructed legal argument, built by human lawyers and diplomats who understood exactly how to stand at the very edge of what the Concord could punish without appearing to declare open conflict. Humanity, still new to galactic politics, had not yet signed on to the older treaties that bound most other species to Concord judgments. It was a loophole, deliberately exploited, and it worked exactly as intended. The Concord blockade ships did not fire. They could not without becoming the villains of a story that human broadcasters were already sharing across dozens of settled worlds, a story of a small young species standing up for a forgotten people against an ancient and powerful alliance. Whether the Concord feared that story or simply had not yet decided how seriously to take humanity, I did not know, but their weapons stayed silent, and the supply convoy descended into our system unopposed. What followed were the strangest weeks of my long life. Human engineers moved through our ship, repairing systems that had been broken for generations, patient and skilled in ways that spoke of a species used to solving problems with limited resources. Human doctors examined our elders and our children, and I watched grown members of my own crew weep openly at the sight of medicine they had believed they would never see again. Human traders arrived, not to exploit our desperation as smugglers once had, but to establish what Cole called fair exchange agreements, offering goods at prices that would not further bankrupt a people who had nothing left to give. I asked Hale, during one of our many long conversations in those weeks, what his people expected from us in return for all of this. He looked at me as though the question itself confused him. What do you mean, expect? Every alliance I have known demands payment, I said. Territory, resources, political loyalty, something. What does humanity demand of the Ashurel in exchange for its help? Hale was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved, rather than dismissing it as I half expected him to. I suppose, he said finally, we'd like it if, somewhere down the road, when you're back on your feet and somebody else needs a hand, you remember what it felt like being where you are right now, and you help them. That's it. That's the whole deal. I did not have words for what I felt in that moment. In all my years chronicling the slow, painful history of my people, I had never once recorded an act of kindness that did not eventually reveal itself as a transaction wearing gentler clothing. And yet here, in the quiet, half-repaired corridors of the Vantor, I found myself unable to locate the hidden cost in anything humanity had offered us. It frightened me, if I am honest. It is a strange thing to be more unsettled by unconditional kindness than by open hostility, but hostility I understood. Hostility had rules. This was something else entirely, something I did not yet have the language to describe. I would learn, in the difficult days that followed, exactly how far humanity was willing to go to prove that their kindness had no hidden price, and I would learn that the galaxy, accustomed to the old rules of debt and tribute, was not prepared for a species that had decided, quietly and firmly, to write new ones. Word of what was happening in our system did not stay contained for long. Within 2 weeks, other Ashurel survivors, scattered across distant systems in small hidden vessels we had lost contact with years earlier, began transmitting messages toward the Vantor, drawn by rumors that had spread faster than any of us expected. I remember the day the first of these messages arrived, a trembling voice belonging to an elder named Corwin, broadcasting from a crippled transport ship 4 systems away, asking if the stories were true. "They say humans came," Corwin said, his voice barely holding steady. "They say a species helped the Ashurel without asking for tribute. Tell me this is not a cruel rumor, Zarek. Tell me this is real." I recorded my answer with Hale, standing beside me, watching the exchange with an expression I had come to recognize as quiet, fierce determination. "It is real," I told Corwin, "and if you can reach us, there is a place for you here." Admiral Cole authorized a second wave of supply ships within the day, dispatched to retrieve every scattered fragment of my people that could be found and brought safely to our gathering point. It was, I would later understand, the beginning of something the Concord had never anticipated, not simply the rescue of a single ship, but the slow, deliberate reassembly of an entire scattered people, made possible by a species with no obligation to help us at all. By the 6th week, our small system had become something I never imagined I would witness again in my lifetime. 9 scattered HFY vessels had answered the call and gathered around the Vantor, their crews reuniting with people they had believed lost forever, families rediscovering relatives they thought had died in the long years of separation. I stood on the observation deck one evening, watching children from 3 different ships playing together in a repaired common area, laughing in a way I had not heard from HFY children in longer than I could remember, and I found myself unable to speak for several minutes, overwhelmed by an emotion I did not have a proper word for in my own language. Grace Whitfield, a representative from the human government who had arrived to help coordinate the growing relief effort, found me there, watching the children with tears I made no effort to hide. "You all right, Zarek?" she asked, settling beside me at the viewport. "I have spent my entire life recording the death of my people," I said. "I did not think I would live to record something like this instead." Whitfield smiled, though there was something careful in her expression, something that told me she had news to share that she was not eager to deliver. "I need you to understand something," she said. "What we're doing here, it's not going unnoticed. The Concord is not happy. There's a formal complaint being filed against the United Earth Coalition for what they're calling material support to a sanctioned species. I wanted you to hear that from me before it hits the wider news feeds." I felt the warmth of the moment cool slightly, old instincts rising in me, the familiar bracing for disappointment that 4 generations of survival had taught my people never to abandon completely. "What does this mean for your people?" I asked. "Sanctions? Exclusion from Concord trade?" "Could be worse than that," Whitfield admitted. "Could mean military escalation. If the Concord decides to make an example of us, the way they made an example of you, our government is aware of the risk. We're moving forward anyway." "Why?" I asked, and I meant it as a genuine question, not a challenge. "Whitfield, your species has existed among the stars for barely a century. You have no old alliances to protect you, no ancient fleets to guarantee your safety if the Concord decides you have become inconvenient. Why risk everything for a people you owe nothing to?" Whitfield considered the question for a long moment before answering, her eyes still fixed on the children playing beyond the viewport glass. "Because owing nothing isn't the same as choosing nothing," she said finally. "We could look at what's happening here and decide it's not our problem. Plenty of species have made that choice about you, apparently, for 4 generations running. But somewhere along the way, we decided that just because something isn't required of us doesn't mean it isn't right. I think that's actually the whole point of choosing anything at all." I did not have an answer for that. I simply sat beside her, watching the children, and let her words settle into whatever part of me still remembered how to hope without fear attached to it. The Concord's ultimatum arrived formally 3 days later, delivered not by Marshal Vach this time, but by a figure of considerably greater authority, a Concord general named Corvain Thess, whose reputation, even among my own people, was known for its severity. "The United Earth Coalition has 48 hours to withdraw all personnel, vessels, and material support from HFY territory," Thess announced, his voice carrying across every channel monitored by both human and HFY ships alike. "Failure to comply will result in the coalition being formally designated as an accessory to the harboring of convicted war criminals, with all attendant trade restrictions, travel bans, and military consequences that designation carries under Concord law." I watched this broadcast from the Vantor's bridge, standing beside Hale, who had returned to our system 3 days earlier after a brief absence coordinating with his government. His jaw tightened as the message played, but he did not look away from the screen, and he did not look afraid. "They're bluffing," Ellen Marsh said from her station, though her voice carried less certainty than her words suggested. "Maybe," Hale said. "Maybe not. Doesn't really change what we do next either way." What happened over the following 2 days, I would later understand, became one of the most closely watched political events in humanity's short history among the stars. The coalition's parliament convened in emergency session, broadcasting portions of their debate publicly, a practice I found remarkable given how carefully most galactic governments guarded their internal disagreements from outside eyes. I watched fragments of that debate through translated broadcasts relayed to us by Grace Whitfield, listening to human representatives argue passionately on both sides. Some spoke of caution, of the danger in provoking a power as vast and old as the Concord before humanity had built the strength to withstand serious retaliation. Others spoke with a fire that reminded me powerfully of Hale himself, insisting that a species defined its character not in comfortable moments, but in exactly the kind of difficult choice now before them. It was Admiral Cole, testifying before that same Parliament, whose words I would later have translated and recorded into our own archives, because I believed, even then, that they deserved to be remembered by my people for as long as we continued to exist. We have a choice today that our ancestors did not always have the courage to make, Cole told the assembled representatives, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had seen conflict before and understood its true cost. We can decide that the HFY's survival is somebody else's responsibility, that we did our part by sending a few ships and a few doctors, and that anything beyond that is too dangerous to ask of our people. Or we can decide that when we made the promise, when we said no one gets left behind, we meant it even when it costs us something. I know which choice I want future generations to look back on. I suspect most of you do too. The vote, when it finally came, was not unanimous. I do not believe important decisions ever truly are, but it passed by a wide enough margin that no one could mistake it for uncertainty, and within hours of the announcement, orders went out across human space, authorizing military escort vessels to deploy to HFY territory, standing ready to defend the relief convoys against any Concord action. I stood with Hale on the observation deck as the first escort ships began arriving in our system, sleek gray vessels bearing the same blue and white markings as the transport convoys, though considerably more heavily armed. There were not many of them, not compared to the vast fleets the Concord could summon if they chose to escalate fully, but they were there, standing visibly and deliberately between my people and the void. Your government just risked war with the most powerful alliance in known space, I said quietly, for people most of the galaxy has already decided are not worth remembering. Hale did not look away from the ships arriving on the horizon. Some things are worth remembering precisely because everybody else forgot them, he said. Besides, Chronicler, I don't think this is really about you and me anymore. I think it's about what kind of galaxy we're all willing to live in. I did not sleep that night, nor for many nights afterward, because I understood, watching those human ships take up defensive positions around our fragile, reassembled fleet, that whatever came next would not simply determine the fate of the HFY. It would determine what kind of species humanity had truly chosen to become. The Concord fleet returned 4 days later, and this time, there was no ambiguity about their intentions. I counted the ships myself from the Vantor's bridge, my hands trembling slightly as the numbers climbed past what I had ever seen assembled in one place. Even during the darkest days of the war, my ancestors had fought. 40 warships, arranged in a formation designed for one purpose only, led once again by Marshal Idren Vok, though this time General Corvain Thess rode alongside him aboard the Concord flagship, a vessel so large it seemed to swallow the starlight around it. Against them stood 11 human escort ships, a scattering of unarmed HFY vessels carrying the last of my people, and the small battered form of the Halcyon, still holding its position at the front of our formation as though it had never once considered retreating. "This is General Corvain Thess of the Concord Central Fleet," came the transmission, cold and formal, carried across every open channel in the system. "You are ordered to disperse immediately. HFY vessels will submit to tribunal judgment. Human vessels providing armed resistance will be considered hostile combatants under interstellar law." I stood beside Hale on the Halcyon's bridge, having transferred over at his invitation 2 days earlier, unwilling to watch what might happen from a distance when I could stand with the people who had chosen to stand with us. Ellen Marsh sat at the pilot's station, her hands steady despite the impossible numbers arrayed against us. Admiral Cole's voice crackled through on a secondary channel, coordinating the human formation from his own command ship somewhere behind us. "General Thess," Hale said, his voice carrying none of the fear I would have expected from a man facing 40 warships with 11. "I want to make sure I understand your position correctly. You're planning to open fire on unarmed civilian transport ships, carrying families, children, and elderly people, because a tribunal made a ruling about a war fought before any of them were born? The judgment stands regardless of who currently occupies those vessels," Thess replied. "Bloodline responsibility is a foundational principle of Concord law. You would do well not to lecture me on justice, Captain, when your own species has existed among the stars for less time than some of my officers have served in this fleet." "Maybe so," Hale said, "but where I come from, justice that punishes children for the choices of their great-grandparents isn't justice at all. It's just cruelty with better paperwork." I watched the tension building across every screen on the bridge, watched Concord vessels beginning to shift into attack formation, and I felt the old, familiar despair rising in my chest, the certainty that this was simply how our story would end after all, delayed by weeks rather than avoided entirely. "Zarek," Hale said quietly, not looking away from the view screen, "I need you to trust me on something." "What is that?" I asked. "This isn't over yet," he said, "not even close." General Thess gave the order to advance precisely 11 minutes later. I remember the exact time because I had been counting every second, unable to stop myself, as though marking the passage of time might somehow slow it. The Concord formation moved forward as one, weapons systems visibly charging along the length of their hulls, 40 ships against 11, against unarmed transports, against a handful of terrified survivors who had only just begun to believe they might have a future worth planning for. The human escort ships spread into a defensive line, positioning themselves directly between the Concord fleet and the Asherel vessels behind them, a wall of gray hulls that would not have stopped even a fraction of what was bearing down on them. I understood, watching this, that Hale and Cole and every human aboard those 11 ships knew exactly how outmatched they were, and had chosen to stand there anyway. "Why?" I asked Hale, unable to keep the question contained any longer. "Why would you sacrifice yourselves for us? What could possibly be worth this?" Hale finally looked at me, and in his eyes I saw something I had not expected. Not fear, not grim resignation, but a kind of steady, unshakable conviction that I did not fully understand until much later. "Because if we don't draw a line somewhere," he said, "it just keeps happening. Today it's your people. Next century, it's somebody else's. Somebody has to be the ones who say enough, and mean it, even when it's dangerous. Might as well be us." The Concord fleet opened fire 8 minutes into their advance. I will not pretend the moments that followed were not terrifying beyond anything I had experienced, even during the darkest years of our exile. Weapons fire streaked across the void, human shields flaring bright against the assault, engineers throughout the fleet working desperately to redistribute power to failing systems as the Concord's superior numbers began to tell. I gripped the edge of a console, watching damage reports scroll across secondary screens, watching one human escort vessel lose main power entirely as its shields buckled under sustained fire. "Hull breaches on the Ferris," someone called out from a nearby station. "They're holding, but barely." "Keep the formation tight," Cole's voice ordered over the comm, steady despite everything unfolding around us. "We hold this line as long as we can." I thought in that moment that I was witnessing not a rescue, but simply a slower, more dignified version of the same ending we had been running from for 4 generations, humanity's brave gesture delaying our destruction by mere hours rather than preventing it. And then the sensors began registering new arrivals. Multiple contacts dropping out of faster than light, Ellen Marsh called out, her voice rising with something between disbelief and fierce hope. "Zarek, look at this." I turned toward the main view screen just in time to watch the darkness beyond the Concord fleet erupt with new light. Dozens of vessels emerging from transit space in tight, coordinated formation, their hulls marked with the same blue and white insignia as the ships already fighting beside us. I counted as quickly as I could, my heart's pounding, and stopped somewhere past 60, understanding only then what Hale had meant when he told me the story was not yet over. "This is Fleet Admiral Whitfield, of the 2nd Coalition Battle Group," came a new voice across every channel in the system, calm and utterly commanding. "General Thess, my government authorized this deployment the moment your ultimatum was issued. We have been holding position at the edge of this system for 6 hours, waiting to see whether diplomacy would prevail. It has not. I am formally requesting you withdraw your forces before this engagement escalates further." I recognized the name immediately. Grace Whitfield, the representative who had sat beside me watching Asherel children play only weeks earlier, now commanding what appeared to be a battle group easily rivaling the Concorde's own numbers. General Thess's voice, when it returned, had lost some of its earlier certainty. "You would risk full-scale conflict with the Concorde over a handful of condemned refugees?" "I would risk quite a lot," Whitfield replied, "to make sure the galaxy understands exactly what kind of species humanity intends to be. You have people watching this broadcast on a dozen worlds right now, General. Every civilization out there is deciding, in real time, whether the Concorde still represents justice, or whether it's simply become a system for punishing the weak while protecting the powerful. I'd think carefully about which story you want them to remember." The silence that followed stretched long enough that I found myself holding my breath again, watching the two fleets hang suspended in the dark, neither advancing, neither retreating, the fate of my people balanced on a decision I had no power to influence. "Stand down weapons," Thess said finally, his voice tight with something that sounded, even through the translation, like genuine anger. "This engagement is suspended, pending formal review by Concorde Central Command." I felt my legs nearly give way beneath me, relief and disbelief crashing through me in a wave I did not have the strength to fully contain. Beside me, Hale exhaled slowly, some of the tension finally leaving his shoulders, though his eyes remained fixed on the Concorde fleet as it began, slowly and reluctantly, to withdraw. "You knew," I said, turning to him. "You knew reinforcements were coming." "Suspected," Hale corrected. "Cole and Whitfield don't tell me everything, Chronicler. Military secrets and all that. But I figured our government wasn't about to send 11 ships into that kind of fight without a plan behind it. Just had to trust them long enough to find out." I looked out at the retreating Concorde formation, at the human battle fleet holding steady in the space they had refused to abandon, and at the small, scattered remains of my own people, still alive, still whole, still possessing something I had genuinely believed we would never have again. A future. "Captain Hale," I said quietly, "I do not believe I will ever fully understand your species, but I am deeply, endlessly grateful that the galaxy contains you." Hale smiled, tired but genuine, and placed a hand briefly on my shoulder in a gesture I had come to recognize as distinctly human, warm and simple, and utterly without hidden meaning. "Get some rest, Chronicler," he said. "I think we've all earned it, but something tells me the real work is only just beginning." The weeks that followed the standoff brought changes so rapid that I struggled, even as a trained chronicler, to record them with the care they deserved. News of what had happened in our small, forgotten system spread across settled space faster than any diplomatic channel could contain it, carried by independent broadcasters, by curious traders, by the simple, unstoppable momentum of a story too remarkable for anyone to keep quiet. The Concorde, faced with a public relations crisis it had never anticipated and a military confrontation it had narrowly avoided, found itself under pressure from directions it clearly had not expected. Species who had quietly tolerated the treatment of the Asherel for generations, simply because raising objections seemed pointless against Concorde authority, suddenly found their own populations asking uncomfortable questions. If humanity, a species barely a century into galactic society, could stand against Concorde judgment and survive, what did that suggest about the true strength behind the old alliance's authority? I sat in on many of the negotiations that followed, invited by Admiral Cole and Fleet Admiral Whitfield as a witness on behalf of my people, and I watched something remarkable unfold across those long, careful sessions. The Concord Tribunal, forced to defend a century-old ruling in front of an audience it could no longer control, found its arguments crumbling under scrutiny they had never expected to face. Historians and legal scholars from a dozen species, emboldened by humanity's willingness to challenge the old order, began publicly questioning whether the original judgment against my people had ever been fair in the first place, or whether it had simply been convenient. The evidence used to condemn an entire species, said one such scholar, a scientist from a world called Turnus, whom I met during those proceedings, was thin even by the standards of its own era. 3 colonies were destroyed during the Second Expansion conflict, yes, but records clearly show at least 4 species contributed forces to that engagement. Somehow, only the HFY bore the punishment. I would very much like someone to explain that discrepancy to me. No one could, not satisfactorily, not when pressed by scholars and journalists no longer willing to accept the old, comfortable silence. It took nearly 3 months, but the formal ruling finally arrived, delivered not with the cold formality of Marshal Voch's earlier ultimatums, but through a public statement broadcast across every major channel in conquered space, an acknowledgement I had genuinely believed I would never live to witness. The Concord Tribunal hereby vacates all judgments issued against the HFY people, the statement read, delivered by a senior tribunal official whose name I recorded carefully into our archives, though I will not repeat it here, believing the words themselves matter more than the reluctant messenger who finally spoke them. Full trade rights, travel privileges, and territorial claims are hereby restored, effective immediately. The tribunal acknowledges that the original ruling, issued under different leadership generations ago, did not adequately account for the shared responsibility of multiple parties in the conflict in question. It was not, I understood even then, a true apology. It carried no acknowledgement of the 4 generations of suffering that ruling had caused, no accounting for the lives lost to starvation and disease while my people drifted through hostile space, searching for a home that no longer welcomed them. But it was enough, finally, to open the door back to everything we had been denied for so long. I stood beside Hale when the announcement was made, aboard the Halcyon, watching the broadcast alongside Ellen Marsh and several members of our own crew who had gathered to hear the news together. "It is not justice," I said quietly, once the broadcast ended. "Not truly. Nothing returns what we lost." "No," Hale agreed. "It doesn't. But it's a door that was closed for a long time, finally opening again. What you do with that is up to you now." What we did, over the months and years that followed, was rebuild. The HFY homeworld, a temperate planet called HFY that none of us currently living had ever set foot upon, waited for us exactly as our ancestors had described it, its cities long since reclaimed by forest and time, but its foundations still standing, patient beneath the growth of a century's neglect. I remember the day our fleet finally entered orbit above that world, remember standing on the observation deck of the Vantor beside Erin, both of us weeping without shame as the blue and green surface of our ancestral home filled the view screen for the first time in any of our lifetimes. "We made it," Erin whispered. "Zarek, we actually made it home." Human engineers and volunteers accompanied us for that first difficult year, helping us rebuild infrastructure long since collapsed, helping us plant the first crops in soil that had not felt HFY hands upon it in 4 generations. They did not stay because they were required to, and I watched, again and again, as human volunteers extended their assignments far beyond what any contract demanded, simply because they had grown attached to the people they were helping, and wanted to see the work through to something they could be proud of. Captain Hale himself remained in our system far longer than his original mission had required, eventually settling into something like an informal ambassadorial role between our 2 peoples, though he always resisted any title grander than simply calling himself a friend of the HFY. I asked him once, nearly a year after that first tense standoff against the Concord fleet, whether he ever regretted the risk his people had taken on our behalf. We were standing together on a hillside overlooking one of the first rebuilt HFY settlements, watching children, my people's children, running freely across grass their ancestors had not walked upon in generations, laughing in the golden light of a sunset neither of us needed translation to appreciate. "Regret it?" Hale said, considering the question seriously, as he always did. "Chronicler, look at what's in front of us. I've seen a lot of things in my life, some of them not so good, but I don't think I've ever seen anything that made more sense to me than this. No, I don't regret it. Not for 1 second. I thought often, during those years, about what had made humanity different, about why a species so young to the wider galaxy had proven willing to risk everything for people they owed nothing to, when older, more established civilizations had simply looked away for generations. I never arrived at a complete answer, though I came to believe it had something to do with the particular nature of human memory, their strange, deliberate habit of choosing to remember their own failures rather than simply moving past them, using that memory as fuel for something better rather than as a source of shame to bury and forget. Admiral Cole, whom I came to know well during those years of rebuilding, once explained it to me in terms I have never forgotten. We had been discussing the old records of humanity's own difficult history, the periods where his species, too, had abandoned people who needed help, prioritized convenience over compassion, made the same mistakes that had nearly ended my own people entirely. "We're not perfect," Cole told me, sitting across from me in the growing garden of what would eventually become the first permanent human embassy on HFY. "Never claimed to be. But I think there's something powerful in a species that chooses to look directly at its own worst moments, instead of pretending they never happened. Every time we remember what it felt like to leave somebody behind, it makes it that much harder to do it again. That's not virtue, chronicler, that's just stubbornness, applied in the right direction." 5 years after that first desperate broadcast reached the Halcyon sensors, I stood before a gathering of nearly the entire HFY population, now numbering in the tens of thousands as scattered families continued finding their way home from every corner of settled space, drawn back by news of our restored homeworld. We had gathered at the base of a new monument, built in the central plaza of our capital city, a simple structure of pale stone that had taken nearly a year to construct, funded entirely by HFY resources, though the design itself had been proposed by our youngest generation, children who had grown up hearing the story of our rescue, told and retold until it had become something closer to legend than memory. The monument depicted 2 hands reaching toward one another, one clearly HFY in shape, the other unmistakably human, separated by a small gap that the sculptor had left deliberately unfinished, meant to represent, as the young artist explained to me, the ongoing nature of the friendship it commemorated, a bond still being built rather than something already complete and finished. Beneath the 2 reaching hands, carved into the stone in both HFY script and the human alphabet, was a single phrase, the same words Captain Hale had spoken to me during our very first conversation aboard the dying Vantor, words that had since become something close to a shared philosophy between our 2 peoples. No one gets left behind. I stood before the gathered crowd that day, an old chronicler now, my once dark hair fully silvered with age, and I delivered what I knew would be one of the final entries in the long history I had spent my life recording. "There was a time," I told the assembled crowd, my voice carrying across the plaza with the help of amplification systems the humans had helped us install, when I believed I would live only long enough to record the ending of our people. I stood upon the bridge of a dying ship, certain that the final chapter of the HFY would be a quiet one, unremarkable, unremembered by a galaxy that had already decided we did not matter. I paused, looking out at the crowd, at faces both old and young, at children born on this reclaimed homeworld who had never known the desperate drifting their parents and grandparents had endured, and I found myself smiling despite the weight of memory pressing against my chest. "I was wrong," I continued, "not because I failed to understand our own strength, though I have come to believe we possess more of that than I once gave us credit for. I was wrong because I failed to account for the simple, stubborn kindness of strangers who decided, for reasons that still humble me to consider, that our survival mattered, even when nothing obligated them to believe so. I gestured toward the monument beside me, toward those two reaching hands frozen forever in pale stone. We were forgotten once, I said, erased from the concerns of a galaxy that found it easier to abandon us than to question the fairness of our punishment. But we are not forgotten now, and I do not believe we ever will be again, because somewhere among the stars, a small, determined species looked at our suffering and refused to look away, not because they had to, but simply because they chose to. I looked out at the crowd one final time, at the future of my people stretching before me in a way I had genuinely believed impossible only a handful of years earlier, and I spoke the closing words I had prepared, words I hoped would be remembered by Asherel children for generations still to come, long after I myself had become nothing more than another name recorded in our restored archives. Let it be remembered, by every generation that follows, that the darkest chapter of our history did not end because we finally proved ourselves worthy of rescue. It ended because someone decided that worthiness was never the question that mattered. Let it be remembered that when the entire galaxy had turned away from us, humanity stepped forward instead, asking nothing, expecting nothing, offering only the simple, radical belief that no one, anywhere, deserved to be forgotten. The crowd's response was not loud, not the roaring celebration one might expect from such an occasion. It was quieter than that, more solemn, hundreds of voices joining together in a phrase that had become, in the years since our rescue, something close to a sacred vow among my people. No one gets left behind. I looked toward the edge of the crowd, where Captain Hale stood beside Ellen Marsh, both of them older now too, their hair touched with the same silver that marked my own, and I saw Hale mouth the words along with the gathered crowd, his hand resting once again on my shoulder as it had that first difficult night aboard the Vantor, when I had first begun to believe that hope might not always be simply grief arriving early. That evening, as the sun set behind the mountains of our reclaimed homeworld, I made one final entry into my personal archive, the closing note of a chronicle that had begun in despair and found its way, against every reasonable expectation, towards something I could only describe as genuine, hard-earned hope. The Asherel were forgotten, I recorded, my voice steady despite the weight of everything those simple words carried. We were abandoned by every ally we once trusted, condemned for sins that belonged to our ancestors rather than ourselves, left to drift through the darkness until nothing remained but the slow, quiet certainty of our own ending. And then, when we had stopped believing rescue was even possible, a single unarmed ship answered a beacon that everyone else had long since stopped listening for, and everything changed. I paused, looking out through the window of my small home, built with human tools on Asherel soil, at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above, somewhere among them the distant, familiar shape of Earth, a world I had never visited but had come to think of, in some strange and permanent way, as a second homeland for my people. We were forgotten, I said, closing the recording, closing in many ways the long and difficult chronicle of my people's near destruction, and then humanity remembered us, when no one else would. I do not know what the future holds for either of our species, but I know this: whatever comes next, we will face it together, and we will not forget what it means to reach out a hand to someone the rest of the galaxy has decided to leave behind. The recording ended there, and I sat for a long while in the quiet of that evening, watching the stars gather overhead, feeling, for the first time in longer than I could measure, something that was not simply hope, but something steadier, something closer to peace. We were no longer forgotten. We never would be again.